Halo 2 is a game of halves. What does that mean? Well, it's a catchy title for a critique video for one, but more than that, the game is fractured. It's a game composed of many different pieces, some of them excellent and some of them not so much. The story is split in half, the game itself is split into two halves, and along with it, for one of the first times in game history, the fanbase is split in half. And ultimately, it's only half a game that wouldn't be finished for another 3 years. Do these halves come together to create a greater whole? Sometimes they absolutely do, and sometimes Halo 2 is the most frustrating game in the entire series. But considering the pressure and time constraints put on Bungie having to make a sequel to one of the best-selling games of all time, with the weight of supporting an entire console generation on their back, it's kind of a miracle that Halo 2 even exists at all. With almost 2 decades of separation, the things that make Halo 2 strange and weird are buffered away. The infamous cliffhanger ending will never bother anyone again because Halo 3 exists, and the resolution is just a simple click away. The misleading marketing that hid an entire second aspect of the story is no longer relevant to anyone playing the game nowadays. Halo 2 is arguably even more influential than Halo 1 was, and its massive success distracts from the fact that almost everything that Halo 2 does was a massive risk that anybody would have predicted to be a train wreck, including the people who made it. Halo 2 is one of the most ambitious games ever made, but the reality is that half of that ambition never got to see the light of day, because the developers were way too ambitious for what they could actually achieve, which resulted in one of the most infamous crunch periods in game history. And you know what? You'd never even guess playing the game. My relationship with Halo 2 is complicated. As I said in the last video, I started with Halo 3 and then later went back to Halo 1 with the Anniversary Edition. I never did that for Halo 2, at least not until the Master Chief Collection, so it is by far and away the Halo game that I have played the least. In fact, I had never played the game through in its original graphics until making this video. It's a good game, I can tell you that even playing it years after the fact. I think it holds up significantly better than Halo 1, in the way that most games towards the end of a console generation do, when they've really figured out the hardware and how to push it to its limits. It's immediately apparent to me why it was so successful. More so than Halo 1, it's Halo 2 that really cemented Halo's place in pop culture. It's also a game that broke people, both physically and mentally. There's been a few exposés over the years about the working conditions at Bungie during the production of Halo 2, but all of them share a common sentiment. It was awful. People worked 60-hour weeks for a year and a half. People slept in the office for a full month. Marriages failed. One designer talks about having to put his dog in a kennel for a month because he wasn't spending enough time at home to care for it. In a Eurogamer retrospective of the production, Chris Butcher, the lead engineer, is quoted as saying, "The crunch on Halo 2 was, oh my god, we're fucked. We're all going to die." So that just sounds like a blast. And what did they get for that effort? Well, one of the best-selling games of all time, often considered one of the best games ever made. All of that blood, sweat and tears completely paid off. I'm not sure that was the best lesson for the games industry to learn, quite frankly. The uncomfortable truth about games industry crunch is that it often does work, at least if you define shipping a good and popular game as success. It would be easier to totally condemn the process if it didn't. It's ridiculous to have people work 60 hours and sleep in the office, it's totally insane. But it does work though, doesn't it? Look at Halo 2. The problem is, we really don't have anything to compare it to. Crunch culture is so thoroughly ingrained in the games industry that it was an expected and accepted element of the course I took to learn game design. Working 12-hour days on a project that I was paying for the privilege of creating. A crunch period is practically built into the development cycle of a game, especially in the AAA spaces, but indie games are absolutely not immune either. We simply don't know another way, and until we start a game dev union, we never will, because the incentives to crunch are too high. Just look at the success of Halo 2. More so than Halo 1, Halo 2 feels like a transitionary title. It feels like the first modern FPS in the good ways and in the bad ways. And one of those bad ways is almost certainly the details of its production, because it's not a unique story. Everything about Halo 2's story you can basically repeat word for Red Dead Redemption 2's production. It was years of crunch, people lost their families, their mental health, and then the game came out and it's incredible. It hit new records for sales figures. It's one of my favourite games. This still happens all the time. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about this. I don't know how to reflect on it years after the fact. Does the fact that it came out amazing make up for the human cost of making it? Certainly some of the creators think that. In that quote about how they're all going to die, Chris Butcher goes on to say that he still thinks the work they did was awesome. The reality is, I have a lot of nice things to say about this game, but I don't want to ignore the human cost that went into making those nice things. I hate being hyperbolic like this, but Halo 2 is genuinely one of the most important games ever made. It defined the trajectory of the modern shooter. It's a game that should be studied, a game that I want to study, but a thorough study should include all of the ugly details as well as the good ones. Halo 2 starts almost immediately following the events of Halo 1. Master Chief and Cortana have returned to Earth and are being rewarded for their mission, but the ceremony is intercut with the trial and disbarment of your rival. You didn't know he was your rival, but he's the elite who was in charge of the Covenant fleet that chased you to Halo. He let the Sacred Ring be destroyed, and the Grand Council of the Covenant has deemed this an act of heresy. This immediately establishes a totally different tone to Halo 1. Halo 2 is driven much more by characters and politics than it is by action and adventure. Not to say it doesn't still have that, it has it in spades, but starting out here, we're in prequel levels of alien politics. Halo 1 was ultimately a game about survival. You're trapped on a ring full of monsters and you need to survive. Halo 2 is about a war, and the best way to understand a war is to show you both sides of it. Halo 2 massively expands the lore and world building of Halo, particularly around the Covenant, by anchoring half of the story to this elite. But at the start of the game, that's not clear. In fact, this entire half of the story was a secret that wasn't even revealed until the game was released. Halo 2's marketing is notable for two things. One is that it was the first game trailer ever to be shown in movie theatres, showcasing the game's commitment to being cinematic and movie-like. They were confident enough to put it up next to trailers for actual movies. The second thing is its 2003 E3 demo showcase. At the time, it was one of the coolest, most hyped showcases around, and it's almost pure lies. Pretty much nothing in this demo actually ended up in the final game, because at the time that they made it, they didn't even have a working game yet. The demo shows dramatic lighting that wasn't in the final game. It shows advanced AI scripting specifically for Marines that wasn't in the final game. It shows a brute, one of the new enemy types, boarding a vehicle and swatting the drivers out, something that's not only not in the game, but there isn't even a moment in the game where the brutes show up on Earth. The entire level shown in the demo was made just for the demo. It's not in the game. That's not exactly uncommon for E3, may God rest its soul, but for Halo 2 it's particularly noteworthy because after this demo they realised that they couldn't make a full game of this demo. So they scrapped everything they'd been working on and started from scratch, hence the year and a half of crunch. And I can't really overstate just how little you can tell. Never in a million years would I have guessed that this game was put together in a frenzy over a year and a half. It feels about 5 times as big as Halo 1, yet it's not even half the size that they had originally planned. For example, Quarantine Zone, which is one of the largest levels in the game, is apparently only 20% of the original map that they had created. That's the level of overambition they were aiming for. Halo was never planned to be a trilogy. The entire story of Halo 3 was supposed to be a part of this game. There wasn't supposed to be a cliffhanger ending, it's just something they had to do if they ever actually wanted to release the game. On the multiplayer side, there was supposed to be a massive new game mod with more players and AI enemies, something that wouldn't even become viable until Halo 5, over 20 years after they initially conceived the idea. That's the thing about cut content. It's cut. You have no way of knowing what's actually missing, and therefore you don't feel like anything is missing. Halo 2's cliffhanger may have been unsatisfying, but it's not as if Halo 2 feels like half a game. It feels absolutely jam-packed. And it's not because they were putting in as much stuff as possible, it's because they put in way too much stuff and were trying to keep as much of it as possible. This isn't actually that uncommon. Game designers and artists are massive overachievers. Despite what Twitter may tell you, there's no such thing as a lazy game developer. But the thing about Halo 2 is that it really is warranted. I think it's fair to say that Halo 2 was one of the most anticipated games ever made. Halo 1 was a smash success that changed the game landscape, so a sequel to it would have to have the same impact. This couldn't just be an ordinary sequel, it had to be something spectacular. So they had huge chunks of the game from the marketing. The original trailers make it look like it's going to be a game about defending Earth from an alien invasion, but that's only the first 3 missions of the game before it goes in all sorts of different directions. There are many changes between Halo 1 and 2, but the one that's most immediately notable is the atmosphere. A lot of the feeling of Halo 1 is that feeling of being trapped and isolated with just you and Cortana for long stretches. Halo 2 wants to tell a more bombastic wartime story, and to accomplish that, it gives you some friends. Alongside Chief this time is Sergeant Johnson, who was also in Halo 1, although at the time he wasn't really an important character. More of a stand-in for your typical army sergeant. He shows up and dies in several missions and keeps coming back again. But fans liked him and Bungie liked him, so in this game he's given a much more significant role, being one of the game's most important characters alongside Miranda Keyes, the daughter of Captain Keyes from the first game, who's a commander in the Navy herself. The Master Chief is kind of a poor representation of humanity, being the faceless warrior that he is, so it's these other human characters that truly connect you to the conflict. They're the reason you're fighting.
You hit Marine?
No, sir.
Then listen up! The Chief is gonna jump in this tank, roll across the bridge, and blow up any inhuman son of a bitch dumb enough to get between him and the Prophet of Regret. Pull yourself together, because you're going with it.
What about that scarab?
We've all run the simulations. They're tough, but they ain't invincible. Stay with the Master Chief. He'll know what to do.
Yes, sir, Sergeant.
Thanks for the tank. He never gets me anything.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
The Earth invasion is kind of a mystery, since the Covenant didn't come with a fleet nearly big enough to conquer the planet, almost as if they didn't expect humans to be there. And they only land in one place, Mombasa, Kenya, in East Africa. What's more is that the ship apparently had a prophet on board, one of the 3 leaders of the Covenant. It's a mystery that won't be solved until Halo 3. It would have been in Halo 2, but from this point you can just take it for granted that anything in Halo 3 was probably supposed to be in Halo 2. Fighting through the streets of Mombasa has a totally different feeling to anything in Halo 1, and it highlights where Halo 2's greatest improvement really is: level design. Halo 2 has some of the tightest level design in the entire series. The way that the Mombasa sections of the game unfold constantly into different arenas, different scales of fights and combat is truly remarkable. First you start with a small enclosed courtyard fending off waves of enemies, then you fight through tight interwoven back streets, then you emerge out into the waterfront and take a warthog down the beach past different enemy encampments. Then you drive into a massive underground highway and whiz past patrols of Covenant in the tunnels. Then immediately flowing into the next level, you get given a tank for an all-out assault across this massive bridge. And after a quick dip back into those tunnels past a blockade for close quarters combat, you emerge into this nature reserve with a perfect sniper position, which, after you've mopped up, you can jump onto the turret of a friendly Marine's warthog and have an almost on-rails experience for a bit, blasting everything that gets close, eventually ending up in this massive city centre area. But we're not even done yet, because after clearing those tanks you climb up and jump onto a massive mechanical scarab and take it down from the inside while it's still moving. Like I said, this is technically 2 different levels, but because the second one starts right where the last one ended, it doesn't feel that way. It just feels like one massive adventure broken up by a quick cutscene. The constant mixing and matching of different arenas where different methods of combat are required is what keeps the game so dynamic to play. Another game might pick one of these areas to focus on completely. We're going to focus on tight corridor shooting, or we're going to focus on wide open vehicle combat. But constantly and surprisingly cycling through them gives both of them more impact. And to do all of that while keeping a world that feels cohesive and realistic is incredibly impressive. These arenas don't feel like arenas, they just feel like normal places a city would have. The bridge isn't just a cool set piece, it's a world building detail. This fancy bridge is what connects the new parts of the city to the old parts of the city, and that's reflected in the design. From old rundown brick and concrete on one side to shiny metal and glass on the other side. I think this is why people weren't so mad about the E3 demo being fake. I mean, it's not as if what we actually got was worse than that demo, aside from the fancy lighting, just different. The actual gameplay mechanics have been smoothed out a bunch from Halo 1. Things feel much tighter to control, especially driving, which no longer feels like you're constantly on ice. Why is that? Well, it's because they decided to rebuild the entire engine because they were insane. For the first year of this game's development, they literally couldn't play the game because the framework to play it was being rebuilt from scratch. That's not to say it's all an improvement. Halo 2 isn't balanced quite as tightly as Halo 1. The game has some massive spikes in difficulty, and on Legendary, Halo 2 is the hardest game in the series, to the point of being borderline unplayable in some parts. There's also a lot more redundancy in the weapon balancing. In the first game, every weapon had strengths and weaknesses, but this time around there are weapons that you're basically never going to use, like the pistol, which is pretty much worthless. Dual wielding was a popular addition, the ability to hold certain smaller weapons two at a time, but in terms of game balance, what that actually means is that any weapon that you can dual wield is made weaker to incentivize dual wielding. SMGs don't do enough damage unless you're holding two of them, and when you do, you burn through ammo at an alarming rate. It looks cool, but tactically speaking, there's never really a good reason to do it. On the other side, the battle rifle and Covenant carbine are so absurdly efficient that you're just being stubborn if you're not always carrying one. They're pinpoint accurate, have long range, have large ammo capacities, and kill most enemies with a single shot to the head. The level design isn't completely consistent either. There's definitely still a few levels that fall back on shooting through corridors. But really, this is the kind of criticism that takes a game from a 10 to a 9.9. It's not that serious in the grand scheme of things. If there's a game out there that's perfect, I've yet to find it. Fighting on Earth signifies one important thing, that one way or another this war is coming to an end. Even if the Covenant didn't bring the full fleet, they know where it is now, and it's only a matter of time until that fleet comes. And of course that time is Halo 3. For now, the Prophet of Regret flees the scene with Commander Key's ship, confusingly called In Amber Clad, following close behind. But we don't follow them for now. Instead, we switch perspectives. The elite from before, the one being stripped of his rank and branded a heretic, instead of being executed, the Prophets offer him a second chance, give up his old life and become the Arbiter, a sort of holy warrior sent on suicidal missions by the will of the Prophets. This elite is no longer our rival, and the opening wasn't establishing him as a villain. This weird, lanky, split-jawed alien is our second protagonist. In fact, despite being the centerpiece of the Master Chief Collection, Halo 2 is arguably more the Arbiter story than it is the Chief's. For how much of the game is actually focused on the Arbiter, I think it's insanely impressive that they kept it totally hidden from all the marketing. It feels like a very modern sort of twist. In fact, it's basically the same twist The Last of Us 2 pulled. It takes a hell of a lot of confidence to take a character with this design and say, yeah, we're going to make you emotionally attached to this monster man, and there are so many ways it could have gone wrong. There are some people who can't get there, but for most people it does work, and it's because everything about it just fits together. If the music had been overdone, then it would come across as cheesy. If the character models and animations looked too goofy, then you couldn't take it seriously. If the voice acting was too campy, then it would all fall apart. And that's why they brought in Keith David, who brings what I can only describe as Shakespearean gravitas to the role.
Drawn quite a crowd. If they came to hear me beg, they will be disappointed. Are you sure?
The two halves of Halo 2's story are separated in many ways, by level design, by mechanics, but most importantly they're separated by what sort of story they are. Master Chief's story is that of continual triumph. He is a great hero, a Spartan just like the warriors of old. The Arbiter's story is a tragedy. He's a fallen hero, a man of honour whose system of honour makes him far too susceptible to manipulation. Your first mission as Arbiter is to hunt down a real heretic, someone openly opposing the words of the Prophets, and in doing so the game trickles out what those words actually are. The Covenant reveres the Forerunners, the ancient race who built Halo, as gods. They hold their technology as sacred, and most importantly they believe that activating the rings will usher in the Great Journey, a transcendent pilgrimage to eternal peace and eternal life. We know from the first game that none of this is true. The rings are not a spiritual artifact, they're giant super weapons built for the purpose of destroying Flood. And that dramatic irony is woven throughout the Arbiter's story. The heretic you're hunting down is right about everything, but at this stage in his journey, the Arbiter isn't ready to hear it. The missions to hunt down the heretic are generally considered to be some of the weakest in the game, and while they're not nearly as dramatic as Master Chief's missions on Earth, I think that's exactly the point. RB and the Chief play pretty much identically. The only differences are the colour of your UI, and instead of a useless flashlight, the Arbiter can activate temporary invisibility, which, if you remember you have it, is very useful. The way that the game makes the two perspectives feel different is through level design. Master Chief, like his armour's namesake, is a hammer. He's not subtle. His missions are all about getting in and destroying everything. The Arbiter is a sword. His missions are quieter, less bombastic, stealthy. The game quite cleverly flips this dynamic as the campaign progresses, but right now that's how the game establishes the differences between each character's approach. The game also uses this mission to reintroduce the Flood much earlier in the game than you're expecting, because it turns out that the station that the Heretic is hiding on has a bit of a flood infestation. Mechanically, the Flood still aren't that interesting to fight, though the little ones are made more annoying with the ability to jump into and revive dead Flood farms over and over again unless the body is completely destroyed. The main purpose of these two missions is to build up the two key relationships of the Arbiter's story. One is with Tartarus, the brute chieftain who serves as something of a rival, stealing your glory and rubbing it in your face. And the other is the half-jawed elite commander who builds up a battlefield camaraderie and respect with the Arbiter over the course of the campaign. These characters do have names, by the way, but they're never used in the game for reasons that I don't really understand. Well, for the Arbiter I get it. Like Master Chief, he's supposed to be a symbol more than a man. But for Halfjaw here, a name would be helpful. Unfortunately, it's Ratas Vadami, which is probably why they don't use it much. It's also strange and a little distracting that the Covenant use the names that humans give them. Elites, brutes, grunts, because these are clearly combat designations and not actual species names. The elites are actually called the Sanghili, the brutes are actually called the Jiralhanai, but they always refer to themselves and each other as their human code names. It's possible they felt using these made-up alien names would be a step too far and come across as too silly or confusing. Or they were just sick of renaming things. Another wrinkle to the many production issues is that a few months before launch, the legal team decided that they had to rename the Arbiter, who was originally called the Dervish because of fears about its associations with Islamic culture. Remember that 2004 is still firmly a post-9/11 world. And that must have been a nightmare to change so close to launch, and yet, once again, I never would have guessed. There's really only one place where the game does feel rushed, and that's in the boss fights. Unlike Halo 1, Halo 2 does include a few boss fights throughout the game, and they're all quite gimmicky and not very fun. I mean, the second one is basically a joke. The first one here against the Heretic leader is just annoying. He summons some holograms of himself to distract you while running away to hide. It's not difficult, just kinda dull. The combat systems of Halo aren't set up for a good boss fight, which is why Halo 1 correctly didn't bother with them. It does reveal one thing though, the source of the Heretic's heresy. 343 Guilty Spark, who's revealed to have survived the explosion of Halo. He's seemingly up to something with these heretics, but it doesn't matter because Tartarus swoops in to steal him before the Arbiter can deliver him to the Prophets.
That is the Oracle. So it is. Come, we are leaving this system.
Each campaign unfolds concurrently, or at least that seems to be the way it's presented. Arbiter's mission to hunt down the Heretic is happening at the same time as Master Chief's crusade through New Mombasa. This kind of multiple perspective storytelling isn't unusual anymore, it's something that Call of Duty would take and run with. But at the time, this kind of dynamic, interwoven storytelling for a game where you shoot aliens was not the standard. It takes the cinematic quality that Halo 1 was aiming for to an entire new dimension, adding in cinematic drama and character arcs and emotionality alongside the action and mystery. It also makes Halo 2 one of the most difficult to summarise in a pithy manner, because its interconnected nature makes almost every event important to the story. Things in Chief's story will affect the Arbiter's story and vice versa. For now, we're jumping back to the Chief. Regret has taken them somewhere that you could probably have predicted. Another Halo ring. A Halo 2, if you will. The surroundings are similar, but the vibe is totally different this time around, because this time you know what to expect, and you're on the offensive. Regret wants to activate this ring and start the Great Journey, so obviously you've got to stop him. Keyes and Johnson go to secure the index, which means thankfully you don't need to do the library again, while Chief goes to take out the Prophet in the previously mentioned joke boss fight where you jump on his floating chair and awkwardly punch him to death. Just before that, though, the tides turn against Chief as High Charity, the Covenant's big space mushroom capital city, appears overhead, along with the entirety of the Covenant fleet. You manage to take out Regret, but the fleet bombards the building and the Chief is plunged into the depths, where something grabs him.
This is not your grave. But you are welcome in it.
That's probably fine. No need to worry about that. It's Arby's turn. And he's been dispatched to find the sacred icon that will activate Halo, aka the same index that Keyes and Johnson are after. The game arranges things so that you never have to kill any humans, and it does that by introducing the bigger threat. The Flood are on this ring too. In fact, there's a shield around the library for some reason, so you absentmindedly deactivate it, which unleashes a massive Flood outbreak that decimates humans and Covenant alike. It's the same chaos we got at the end of Halo 1, only this time we're only halfway through the game. Humans, Flood, Sentinels, and Covenant all fighting each other. And the Arbiter has to slip through the chaos to find the index. I lied before, you do still have to do the library again, but only a teeny tiny bit. It's more of an Easter egg at the end of the level than an actual level, thankfully. The Arbiter ends up in a fight with Keyes and Johnson where he pretty handily deals with them, but once again Tartarus swoops in to steal the glory, taking the humans captive and taking the index, and throwing you down an endless pit now that your usefulness is at an end.
When the prophets learn of this, they will take your head when they learn. Fool. They ordered me to do it.
So now both of our heroes have been thrown down big holes, and that's the perfect chance to meet up as something brings them together. A giant, writhing mass of teeth and tendrils. This is the Gravemind, the collective consciousness of the Flood, and it represents a threat much greater than the Covenant ever did. With both heroes in its grasp, it could easily infect them both and add to its army. But it doesn't. It talks to them instead, which somehow makes it so much more threatening. The Gravemind is a truly disgusting design, especially in the Anniversary Remaster, but it talks in a strangely eloquent, albeit cryptic way. It's not just a monster, it has motivations, it has schemes, and right now, it wants to survive.
Kill me or release me, parasite. But do not waste my time with talk. There is much talk, and I have listened through rock and metal and time. Now I shall talk, and you shall listen.
To do this, it needs to convince the Arbiter out of his delusions, so it brings out two voices, the captured Monitor of the Ring, and the Prophet of Regret, now a horrific flesh tendril. It explains to the Arbiter that the Great Journey is false, that the reality of the ring is just that it will kill them all. Now that the Prophets have the index, it's only a matter of time until they activate it and kill them all, so the Gravemind needs them to find the index and stop it for its own survival. The Arbiter isn't convinced at first, but regardless, it teleports each of them to a likely place for the index to be found.
Fate had us meet as foes, but this ring will make us brothers.
Last time I praised Guilty Spark for feeling authentically ancient by being a kooky little weirdo, but the Gravemind feels ancient in an entirely different way. It's completely inhuman. The Covenant are aliens, sure, but they bicker and squabble and get involved in messy politics just the same as humans do. War with them is just war. The Gravemind is an ancient, godlike entity. The parallels to Lovecraft are obviously intentional. It wants to consume everything, but it can't do that if everything dies, so it's using you to its own ends. And that level of thought and intelligence makes it so much more menacing than if it just tried to kill you. This is not an enemy that you can ever kill in a big boss fight. The fact that your goals are aligned with an ancient all-consuming entity is not necessarily a good thing, but for now you don't really have a choice. Chief is sent right to the centre of High Charity and the Arbiter is sent to the Ring's control room, both of which are very well thought out choices by the Gravemind. It's not necessarily rooting for either of them to succeed. Sending Chief to High Charity is a suicide mission. It's an entire city of nothing but Covenant, and he's going in without a gun. The fact that the Chief survives anyway is part miracle and part due to the political situation. The Brits didn't just turn on the Arbiter, they turned on all of the elites following the Arbiter's trial and the death of Regret. The head prophet, the Prophet of Truth, has decided that the Brits are better fit to lead the Covenant armies. I'm sure the fact that they're much easier to manipulate has nothing to do with it. A civil war breaks out between the Covenant forces while the Chief is there, which just adds even more factions of enemies to the tangled web we already had. The Arbiter realises this at the same time, though obviously he's a little more personally invested in that civil war than the Chief is. He fights alongside some other elites to try and save as many as possible. It's not until these last few missions that the Brits are actually introduced as an enemy, and they are very annoying. They don't have shields, but they do have a ton of health, and sometimes they'll drop the gun and aggressively charge you, which is actually when they're at their most dangerous, since they can close the distance fast and deal a lot of damage, or just fling you off the edge of a cliff. The Star of Chief's mission on High Charity is infamous because on high difficulties you will die within seconds of spawning if you don't move, and you have to take out the highest level of brute enemies with only the scraps of weapons you can gather. The mechanical differences are good at showing the differences between the elites and brutes. The elites are noble warriors, while the brutes are barbarians. But the brutes are also a little odd with how they don't really match the aesthetic of the rest of the Covenant. They're missing all the bright colours that make the Covenant so distinct. These two contrasting approaches to the Covenant Civil War are also where the game makes one of its biggest story issues clear, and why the game feels more like the Arbiter's story than the Chief. The Arbiter has a deep personal connection to this war, and the Chief doesn't, because Master Chief just isn't a very dynamic character. This is another one of those halves. The split between the game's two protagonists isn't just a split in perspectives, it's a split in time. The Master Chief comes from an old breed of game protagonists, in that he's more of an avatar for the player than he is a character, in the same vein as Doomguy or BJ Blazkowicz. He talks, which makes him more distinct than those characters, but he doesn't say much of substance. He only talks when a question needs to be asked or a one-liner needs to be dropped. He doesn't have a character arc or even a face, because his primary reason for existing is to make the player feel like a badass. You're supposed to imagine that you yourself are the Master Chief. The things the Chief does in this game are completely insane. At the end of the first mission, he pulls off one of the most cartoonishly impractical things in the entire series when he takes a bomb from a space station, flies it into space, and deploys the bomb in an enemy ship. And yeah, it's badass, sure, but really that's all it is, and that's all Master Chief is. He's all flash and no substance, because he's not supposed to be anything more than that. Anything more than that would get in the way of your power fantasy. The Arbiter is different. He comes from a new breed of game protagonists where depth and story arcs take precedence over the power fantasy. You're not supposed to see yourself in the Arbiter. He's a weird, lanky alien after all. Instead, you're along for the journey with the Arbiter, playing to see his story unfold rather than just because you want to shoot the aliens. His story is where the emotional centre of the game is, as his downfall leads to the downfall of his people. But also his own redemption and seeing through the Prophet's lies and falsehoods, becoming a champion of his people once more, but this time for the right reason. It ebbs and flows and has a rival and a friend. It's a much more modern approach to video game storytelling that's become pretty standard nowadays, in large part because of Halo 2's influence. The contrast between the two approaches comes to a head when the two characters meet up. It's the Arbiter that you care more about, and it's the Arbiter that the Gravemind is talking to, because the Arbiter is the character that actually needs to learn something. It lays it out like this.
This one is machine and nerve, and has its mind concluded. This one is but flesh and faith, and is the more deluded.
When you're playing as Master Chief, you're just rooting for him to win. It's simple storytelling. The good guy beats the bad guy. And that's not bad, it's just simple. When you're playing as the Arbiter, you're rooting for him to learn, to see through the manipulation, to see that he's fighting for the wrong side. You're rooting for him to regain his honour. It's much more dynamic storytelling, and, to me at least, much more engaging to play. Even beyond the Arbiter himself, the political machinations and betrayals within the Covenant are much more compelling than Chief's kill-all-the-alien story. Watching as the Prophet of Truth takes more and more power, letting the other prophets die and replacing the elites with brutes makes him a compelling villain. He's not a tactical genius, just an opportunistic powermonger. Tartarus is your rival and likes to rub his success in your face, but the truth becomes clearer and clearer that he's just as much a pawn as the Arbiter is. And by the end, the Arbiter can see that, but Tartarus refuses to. The final climactic mission of the game is the Arbiter's, not the Chief's, stopping Tartarus from activating the ring. For some reason, only a human can activate the ring, so Tartarus brings along Johnson and Keyes, and you reluctantly work together to stop him. It's as big and bombastic as Chief's early missions. The Arbiter is done hiding in the shadows. It's time to take a stand for his people. And that's represented mechanically with this shift in design. The Scarab that Chief destroyed at the start of the game, now you have to defend it as it carves a path of destruction to the control room. Chief's final mission before that, though, is the opposite. While running around High Charity, an Amberclad shows up. It won't answer any hail, and then flood starts pouring out of it. The Gravemind used you. It sent the Arbiter to do the real work of stopping the ring from firing. The Chief was just a grenade thrown in as a distraction for its real plan. It claimed an Amberclad and used it to move into High Charity. This mission might be the creepiest in the whole series as the Gravemind starts to latch itself to the city. Pus and scabs start to form on the walls and floors as the city itself and all of its inhabitants start to become the Gravemind. Truth starts broadcasting motivational propaganda to the people of the city, but as it gets more established, the Gravemind starts responding to him, taunting him. It's a worst case scenario situation. This creature in control of a space-capable city of billions, and all Master Chief can do is run, chasing Truth to the Forerunner ship at the centre of the city. Cortana gets left behind just in case the worst comes to pass. She can detonate an Amberclad's engines the same way they destroyed the first Halo, but that also leaves her at the mercy of the Gravemind.
Run through with truth.
He'll make a girl a promise.
If you know you can't keep it.
This is the beginning of attempting to add some more depth to Master Chief's story by adding some drama to the relationship between him and Cortana being separated, but that won't actually come to fruition until Halo 3. It makes me wonder if they had intended to give the Chief more depth this time around, but like so many other things in this game's production, they just didn't have time to change it. They were already massively out of time as they were. On the other side, after stopping Tartarus from activating the ring, Guilty Spark reveals to the Arbiter and his new human friends that since the ring misfired, all of the rings have been put in a fail-safe mode to be activated from somewhere called the Ark. But we won't learn where that is or what that is for now, because it's time for the words that haunt a generation.
Isolate that signal. Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
I am incapable of feeling the rage and annoyance that this ending caused at the time, because I played Halo 3 before I ever played Halo 2, so I already knew what happens. To me, this is less of a cliffhanger and more of a chapter break. But I get it. As much as killing Tartarus and stopping the ring from firing is a climax, Halo 2 establishes so much momentum and so much tension in its last few missions that to just end here feels wrong. It feels unfinished, which, as we know, it was. This wasn't the intended ending, and the fact that it comes out of nowhere definitely still shines through. It's not that the story has reached a natural conclusion, they've just run out of space on the disc to show it to you. Looking back though, I think it was for the best. There was more than enough story left for an entire second game, and Halo 3 is better for the time it can take to fully wrap up the story. I don't know if that makes Halo 2 better or worse in retrospect, but I do know that it doesn't change all of the things that the game does right. The story is so much more complex and in-depth than anything that Halo 1 was trying, but that story doesn't come at the cost of gameplay. It's still one of the most tightly designed FPS games ever made, and the story is only half the story anyway.
Slayer.
It's arguable that Halo 2's more important legacy than its campaign is online multiplayer. Halo 2 wasn't the first game to have online multiplayer, but it was certainly the most popular, maintaining the top spot on Xbox Live for its entire run until the 360 was released. In fact, Halo 2 was the first game to have built-in matchmaking, a standard feature across the board of all games nowadays. Before this, you would have to either host the game yourself or choose from a big list of servers. It required coordination from the people who wanted to play, but Halo 2's matchmaking system streamlined the whole process and made online multiplayer much more accessible than it ever had been before. And thanks to that innovation, you can get screamed at by random 12-year-olds to this very day. Halo 2 is why shooters are more known as multiplayer titles than for their single-player campaigns. It was one of the first times that people would go out and buy a game just to play online, with many players who never even touched the campaign, something which nowadays is almost expected. Less than half of players ever touch the campaign of a modern Call of Duty title. The servers were shut down in 2010 when the original Xbox Live services were closed, but the game's original multiplayer is available again as part of the Master Chief Collection, and playing it now is strange compared to a modern multiplayer shooter. So much of a modern shooter exists outside of the actual shooting, with customization and battle passes and levels and so many other incentives to keep you playing the game. But those kinds of incentives hadn't been invented yet at the time of Halo 2. You played Halo 2 online just to have fun, which seems silly to say, but the methods for deriving that fun from a shooter have become so much more complicated in the years since. The idea of playing a game without some sort of reward structure feels very strange. Things have certainly taken a turn for the exploitative in recent years, but those incentive structures are not inherently bad. There is fun to be had in seeing numbers go up and unlocking new weapon skins and all this. They're not inherently evil, and I personally have gotten so used to them now that Halo 2 feels almost empty without them. MCC does introduce some of that structure, or at least it does now. It didn't have all that stuff at launch, but even then its unlocks are all focused on the newer games like 3, 4 and Reach. The original Halo 2 has been left mostly untouched. The Master Chief Collection was launched to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Halo 2 and included, like they did for the first game, a full recreation of all the game's graphics, textures, music and effects. However, unlike the first game, this time the anniversary graphics actually look fantastic. Instead of trying to match the modern style, they adapted the game's original style and translated it to modern hardware. And the result is one of the nicest looking games in the entire series. Arguably, in fact, it looks better than Halo Infinite does. Because they didn't shoot for realism and leaned into the cartoonish elements of the design. Everything is bold and colourful, and everything still looks big and chunky, but in a way that's pleasing to look at. It doesn't capture the same tone as the original, it's much brighter and more colourful, but it captures the spirit of the original in a way that Halo 1 Anniversary didn't. The levels that are supposed to be creepy are still actually creepy this time around. They nicely included an example of how bad it could have looked as they also remade some of the multiplayer but outsourced it to a separate studio. And it looks just awful. Everything is way too over-designed, there's lens flares everywhere. And it's made to match the style of Halo 4, the ugliest game in the entire franchise. It's aged badly in a way that the campaign hasn't. A strange little artifact of history is that at launch Halo 2 had extra intro and outro cutscenes that meant to tease Halo 5, but since these scenes are no longer relevant, they've been cut from the game. But you can still find them buried in the menus, and they're worth watching purely to see Keith David absolutely destroy Mike Coulter and prove definitively why you hire voice actors to do voice acting.
My friend's trust is not the issue today, Spartan Locke. It is my trust you must earn. Arbiter. You are a hunter, yes. A seeker of things.
That's not the official job title, but it's close enough.
God, it's painful. At least they've learned their lesson now, right? The cutscenes are actually the standout feature of the remaster done by another outside studio, Blur, who might just be the best CGI artists in the entire business, since their cutscenes look about a decade ahead of pretty much anything else in the movies or games industry. It leads to some strangeness since the cutscenes are no longer rendered in-engine, meaning that things look a bit different when you fade into gameplay. But on their own, these cutscenes are true art that elevate every scene in the game to the absolute peak. Playing the remaster is a different experience to playing the original, but unlike Halo 1, I do think it's a better experience. If you're playing for history, sure, play the original. Just like Halo 1, you can do that with the press of a button. But for the story and artistry and impact, Halo 2 Anniversary is a faithful modernisation. I think Halo 2 is a symbol of everything right and wrong with the games industry. It can create marvels, pieces of art that are amazing and revolutionary and inspiring, and it does so by routinely crushing people's souls. Famously, the game's lead designer and Bungie co-founder Jason Jones left game design for years following Halo 2, not taking on a significant project again until Destiny. The game broke him, and he wasn't the only one. I love Halo 2, genuinely, I think it's a fantastic game, but I wish the industry had learned a better lesson from it. Halo 2's production should have been a cautionary tale. Instead it became a guide. There's so much about Halo 2 to love, so much creativity and ambition and passion, and much, much more stuff that's hidden away as they have to trim away their ambitions to what they could actually fit in the game. And if the people who worked on it don't regret the process that went to making it, then it seems a little weird to argue with them. But, you know, I'm me, so I'm gonna feel iffy about it anyway. They say that every revolution requires blood and sacrifice, but I don't think that's true, and I hope the industry gets a chance to prove that someday.
Silence fills the empty grave now that I have gone. But my mind is not at rest, for questions linger on. I will ask, and you will answer.
All right. Shoot.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to support this channel, or see your name up here, or get access to Patreon exclusive videos, then please consider signing up, it would mean a lot to me. For the previous entry in this series, you can click up here, or for the next entry, you can click down here. I'm going to stop explaining this, but you know, it's future-proofing. Like, if you go back to the Halo 1 video, this video will be there now, it's like magic.